we're in a time in our culture where we are experiencing a multiplicity of issues that just seem to kind of multiply almost endlessly. And you could take any one of these issues, and we won't get into the weeds here on all of these, but you could take any of the kinds of societal issues that we see today, whether they're political or cultural or religious or even in terms of the arts or just any of these things, any of the issues that we see around us. And you as soon as you start looking into it and you start kind of going down that rabbit hole, things begin to multiply and multiply and multiply. And a lot of times that, even some of the solutions that are attempted just seem to actually ultimately create more problems. And those problems continue to multiply endlessly. And it's very similar, I think, in nature to what we talked about in a few episodes prior, where we talked about the Iliad, right? And we talked about the Trojan War and how the Greeks were in this situation where they got into this conflict where they thought it would be a one and done. It was going to be quick and easy. And it turns into this 10 years, this decade-long embroilment, this kind of Vietnam sort of situation, this quagmire that they can't seem to get out of and they can't seem to come to a conclusion. And in the case of the Trojan War, the solution that the Greeks are able to come to is that they're able to unify themselves against a common adversary, right? So it's this sort of situation where the Greek culture has broken down to the point where there's no sort of positive way of unifying themselves, but instead they're able to turn to a negative way of unifying themselves. And they say, well, you know what? Here we are fighting each other. Maybe we should actually fight the Trojans, right? Maybe this is the common adversary that we can unify ourselves against. And it doesn't solve the cultural problem for the Greeks, because they still have this kind of fractured situation going on in their society that has been revealed by the conflict, as we talked about. But at least they're able to unify enough to be able to win the war. But this is, I think, a dynamic that we see a lot when cultures are beginning to unravel, when situations are beginning to unravel, or even in our own lives, even personally, when things begin to fall apart. There's this kind of instinct to sort of look for an enemy, right? It's like, okay, well, where's the enemy, right? And it's this sort of instinct that we have that can actually be very dangerous because it can cause all kinds of infighting and division, which is what happens among the Greeks. But what saves them is that they're able to sort of unite against a common adversary. But in the modern dilemma, it feels like that's something that we really haven't been able to do here in Western civilization. Like, we haven't been able to, there has been that pattern of trying to find an enemy, right? It seems like that's happening all the time in the news and all around us, where things are becoming more and more polarized and combative and so forth. And there's a lot of finger pointing and name calling and all of those kinds of things. And it just feels like it's so hard to even just have a civil conversation anymore with this kind of atmosphere. So there's this sort of instinct of like, oh, we've got to find the enemy. But the problem seems to be that we can't decide on what that enemy actually is, or what that adversary actually is, or which one to prioritize. And I think it's because of the nature of the situation where we find ourselves, which is that there are so many issues. There are so many issues that are constantly cropping up, and every day it's one of those where it's like you almost don't even want to look at the news. You don't want to look at this or that because it's always something new. And the moment that something seems like it's going to be resolved and solved in some way, some other issue springs up, and maybe 5 more underneath that. And so it can become sort of overwhelming, and we can imagine ourselves even in our lives getting into a situation where it's like things just kind of multiply endlessly to the point where you just kind of want to just shut it off because it's too much. It's just too much and too overwhelming. And so there's this sense of division. And what this reminds me of is it reminds me of some of the ancient stories with regard to monsters. And there are stories about a certain kind of monster that we see. There's different kinds of monster stories, monster myths. And one of these kinds of stories has to do with a certain kind of enemy, a certain kind of monster, which is basically the image of the many-headed monster. And we see this all throughout culture. We see this all across the face of the globe. We see it all we see the stories of many-headed serpents or many-headed dragons. We see these in Babylonian myths and Assyrian myths. We see them in Slavic and Eastern European myths. We see other kinds of monsters as well. We even see in the biblical accounts, we see in the apocalyptic narratives, we see the idea of the many-headed beast or the many-headed dragon. And in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament in the Bible, we see these kinds of ideas of multi-headed monsters. And in the Greek myths, in the Greek stories, we see several of these. We see Cerberus, the three-headed dog. We also see the story of the Hydra. And I want to take just a moment to talk a little bit about the story of the Hydra. And the Hydra in Greek myth was basically a many-headed dragon or a many-headed serpent that was set as a guard to one of the doors of the underworld. And so the Hydra is guarding this door to the underworld, which is in a lake or a swamp, and what happens is that the great Greek hero Hercules or Hercules, he is sent to go and fight the Hydra. He has to slay the Hydra as one of these 12 tasks that he's been set upon. And so he goes to this place and he faces the Hydra and he begins to do battle with the Hydra. But what happens is, as he is doing battle with the many heads of this monster, the many kind of snakes, that he begins to discover that every head that he severs, every time that he chops a head off, that two more spring back in its place. And Hercules is this, of course, this mythic, famous figure of just incredible strength, but all of his strength is useless to him. He's unable to defeat this monster because every time that he goes after one of these enemies, two more spring back. And so every time that he attacks one of them, he's actually just making problems worse, and he's just multiplying this. And I think that this is characteristic of the sort of situation that we see in the world today, that I think that there is this sense of the many-headedness of the world, right? And we'll talk more about this in subsequent episodes. There's this kind of multiplicity that just seems to want to multiply itself endlessly. And there's a temptation to want to fight every battle. There's a temptation to want to get pulled in, to respond to every comment, or to, go after every single issue, or to, and it becomes this sort of thing where we begin to fracture almost psychologically because we're being pulled in so many different directions and there's so many different voices that it begins to kind of tear us apart internally. And so what we have to do is we have to think about, how do we respond to this? I think that the way in which we need to respond in the world today, one of the things that can be very helpful for us as we're facing these kinds of dilemmas in the world, is to do what Hercules does, and that is to take a step back, right? So Hercules, the first thing that he has to do in order to keep from being overwhelmed, as he's being overwhelmed by these adversaries, is he has to take a step back. He's got to stop trying to fight every single battle. And as he takes a step back, he's able to survey the situation. He's able to survey the battle that he's in, and begins to be able to look and see, okay, is there a unity, right, behind this? Is there something is there a body out of which all of these many heads spring? Because it looks just like a nest of serpents, and sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where you're like, like with the plumbing, right? It says nest of copper pipes. It's this nest of serpents. It's all of these things. What you have to do is trace it back. You have to look back and see, okay, is there actually a source? Right? Because it's the body of the beast. It's the monster itself that's the adversary. It's not all the many heads, right? To fight out all of those kinds of things is just to get more and more and more ensnared and enmeshed in the trap. But we have to instead look, okay, where is this actually coming from? Is there actually some kind of unity at the bottom? And I think that that's something that we need to do in the world today, is to be able to take a step back, not fight every single battle, but to look and try to see, are there commonalities with some of these issues? And a lot of these issues, they don't seem to have obvious relation to one another, but I think that there actually is. I think that there is a unity. We'll talk about it later in the episode and in subsequent episodes, but I think there is kind of a unity at the bottom. There is something that we can kind of unify against as a common adversary, but we have to be able to look past the snakes. We have to be able to look past all of the various multiplicity of issues and try to go back to the source.